Welcome to the Steve Stine Guitar Podcast, brought to you by GuitarZoom.com. If you want to improve your guitar playing, keep listening. If you want to improve even faster, go to guitarzoom.com, where you'll find all of Steve's premium courses, masterclasses, and memberships that'll help you quickly and easily improve your playing. Now here's your host, Steve Stine.
I've encountered many people that I've talked to about doing content or collaborating or whatever, and they'll go, well, that'd be great, but I don't really know my theory. I don't want people to know I don't know my theory. Like, these are people that other people have listened to on albums and things like that. And I'm always saying the exact same thing. It has nothing to do with theory. Like, what people really want to know is what makes you sound like you. And that leads to another thing, which is the problem I've always had with guitar magazines growing up. You buy, again, Midwestern dude, buying guitar magazines off the shelves. It's the only way I can make a connection to what's happening with the artists that I love. And I'm reading the articles and it's about their gear and it's about whatever. And then there's a transcription of a song. And I'm like, if I had a guitar magazine, I would want to give them a jam and go, I just want you to jam in real time right now. And let's talk about what you were doing. I want to know what was going on in here. It doesn't have to be a technical thing. Just tell me what you were thinking so I can grab something. That's something that we can use as players.
Yeah, it's not about tablature. Tablature is a means to an end. It's a tool to help you understand. Tablature will not explain feel to you. It will not tell you how that tone is achieved. It will not explain to you the emotive quality of the performance. And that's what people are after. I think we've got a great example of this is we just launched, it's in pre-sale now, it goes live next week, a masterclass and what we call an In the Jam with Joe Bonamassa. I mean, Joe is a blues legend, and he didn't think of himself as a teacher. And so one of the ways that Brad and the gang at TrueFire were able to comfort him and get him to feel totally at home with this is, we're not asking you to teach theory. We're asking you to explain and break down your art and your craft in a way that people who are fans of yours but might also like to know how to play. And it's a communion. I'm communing with you. I'm sitting across, just like you and I are sitting across from one another. And instead of it being live, it's time shifted because that's convenient. You can't scale that. You can maybe have 20 people on your Zoom, but guess what? If you record a masterclass, millions of people can watch it.
Whenever you're in the limelight, the one thing is people will always tell you, like, they don't want to be found out. Nobody wants to be found out. Nobody wants to know that I don't really know whatever as well as I'm supposed to know whatever. And the truth is, that's how we just said that. We learned by ear. That's how we all learned. You didn't learn by going to college and studying this stuff. Now, I went to college, but that was later. I already had learned how to play. I just wanted some answers to things that I didn't understand and thought that college would provide that. Now, college did provide that to a certain degree, but what college really provided more than that was a community. It was the people that I met there and made connections to, band connections, interests that I've taken all the way until today that are far more important than any theory or anything that I ever learned when I was in college. And so I think that's one thing that people have to realize is it's easy for us to want to grab onto theory or something because it's a black and white element. 2 + 2 = 4. And so I'm a human. That's something I can grasp onto. Where a groove is something I have to learn to feel. The two opposing sides of your brain arguing with each other. One's an analytical side, one's a creative side.
But you might argue that flow state is when those two things come together harmoniously. And you forget that there's any barrier at all between the sides of your brain, and you're just in the present riding that wave. And I think one of the reasons why this mode, or whatever you call it, this segment, this part of online education is going to be forever, is people are desperate to find a way to get out of their own heads and to surf that wave. One of the easiest ways to do that, right? And really it's about self-actualization at the end of the day, is to sit there and give yourself the gift of the time, energy, and focus to spend time working on your craft. I've always felt very strongly that there was only so far I could go just trying to learn on my own by listening to records. At the end of the day, having the opportunity to talk to somebody like you, listening to your podcast or watching your video is a great example. Watching a lesson or a set of courses on any of our platforms or many other great educational platforms out there, that's a wonderful way. You're really, at the end of the day, you're giving the gift to yourself. I think all of us, what we share, and certainly the people who listen to this podcast and watch your videos, we share this identity of this attunement to music. Are you a music person or not? It's kind of a binary thing. And if you're really a music person, you're dedicating a lot of your life and your energy to it. That feeling of the mastery, or even just the discovery before you've even mastered, oh, that's what you have to do. I've got to pull off the pinky finger. I'm not actually moving. I'm just pulling off. I'm just hammering it on. It's like, oh, wait a minute. It's like, that's why I couldn't get it to sound that way. And that little moment of discovery is like a serotonin drop from your brain down your spine. And you just keep chasing that feeling. And the great news is you can have that feeling when you're 8, and you can have that feeling when you're 88.
That's right. Maybe it doesn't happen as much to a younger generation, but our generation, it's always about theory and technique and all speed and all these things. And they're all important. Don't get me wrong. But you listen to like a great David Gilmour solo.
Oh, yeah.
If you can learn to control and master elements like vibrato, things that make that guitar turn into a voice, more than how smart you are or how fast you are, those all come with practice if you put in enough time to them. But if you can get those things, like Joe Bonamassa is a perfect example. He encompasses all of these different things, but he has the ability when he plays to move you. Sometimes it's a high energy thing, and sometimes it's more of a euphoric feeling that you get when he's playing slower. And those are things that people forget about, is it's not just what's written on a piece of paper. And again, this goes back to us being younger, and you would listen to the music and you would almost like it was a color, like you could listen to the music and you could really hear these things, where now because of technology, sometimes we're not listening as much. We're looking and we're watching, we're reading the tab or whatever, and we're disconnecting from this element, this aural element of hearing these waves and this color moving and making a connection with the instrument that we're playing.
Yeah, I feel that it reminds me of what you said about being hyper-focused on the music you liked at the time and then going back and appreciating it. I mean, Pink Floyd for me is a great example. I certainly knew who they were. I heard Dark Side of the Moon, and I always felt like they were for somebody else. It was for the kid who had the Dancing Bear sticker on the back of his car, and it was just not punk, and it was not metal, and it was not my thing. And my parents had a copy of Wish You Were Here at home. And maybe when I was in my early 20s, I listened to Shine On You, Crazy Diamond. And there's just something about how emotive that playing is. And of course, you find out why it is emotive, because they're basically mourning the loss of the founding member of the band who's been slowly losing his mind. And so there's so much real emotion and feeling in that playing, but there's so much also space and reflectiveness. And of course, when you're listening to Yngwie Malmsteen or Merciful Fate, it's all about speed and technique and craziness. And I loved all that music too, but certainly going back, the irony of all this is there was a point in my life when I was listening to super extreme music where I was like, if you can play super slow and sludgy, but still have a groove, like that to me was everything. My friends were in a band called Winter. Look them up. No one played slower. There were so many bands like that. Saint Vitus, the guys who were like taking the Sabbath thing, the Into the Void style riff, and just going even slower and even lower. Caius, Obsessed. But I mean, it's like there was the whole desert rock thing, but then there was the English stuff, and then there was the crusty stuff. There was so much of that. Cathedral, which was the old lead singer from Napalm Death, they played super slow. I loved all of it. To me, it was finding that space, and those heavy, slow, galloping grooves were in some ways just as exciting and fun. It does take all kinds. You have to keep your ears open. That's for me, it's like, so what you said, we look at things, but if you can actually spend the time to lose yourself in the music. Now, having said that, one of the things that we try to do really hard at True Fire Studios is surround the user with great learning tools, because you really want to feel like you're buttressed, right? So you can see, you can loop a phrase or slow it down without changing the pitch or having the sync tab. So it's really just about surrounding the learner with choices. Do you want to play fast? Do you want to play slow? Break it down. Spend the time that you need. But I couldn't agree more with you. Keeping your ears open is, to me, want to be happy, want to have a successful life? Keep your ears open. Being a good listener is not just about music. It's a life skill.
Yeah, that's right. Boy, that is so true. Okay, so let's do this. So now we're going to go back just a little bit. So we've talked about how you've started playing in some bands, you're singing, you started playing guitar. So where do we go from there? So now you're playing guitar. So where's the next elevation for you into the next place in your life?
So I really knew that I wanted to do something in and around the music industry. And I was a little closer to New York, which was obviously one of the centers of the music industry. Obviously, LA, London, Atlanta being others, Austin, Nashville. But I didn't know anybody in the business, and I wasn't sure how I was going to get my foot in the door. It was just completely unclear to me. I spent a year out in the Pacific Northwest after I graduated from college, and I'd played in bands all throughout college. And when I set up an office for the company I was working for, which was a fundraising consultancy, working for not-for-profits, really not music oriented, but I was out in the Pacific Northwest in the middle of the 90s. I was buying so much music all the time. Now, there was a moment when we opened up this office for this company, and right next door, the office next to us in Portland was a company called Northwest Alliance of Independent Labels. It was basically a one-stop for a whole bunch of the indie labels. And I made friends with all the folks over there, and it was the distribution hub. So I'd go over there and they'd be like, oh, listen to this. And they'd give me cutouts and they'd give me CDs. And I'm sitting there in Portland, Oregon, being like, well, I wanted to move to Portland, and I was seeing all these great bands. I was seeing bands like Heat Miser and 30-06 and great early post first wave grunge, sort of like in that mid 90s era. And I really loved the music scene. And I'm sitting there on the floor of this shipment center for all the CDs going, what am I doing here? I need to figure out a way to get in the music business. So I mentioned earlier that I moved back to New York and I was reading the New York Times and the Help Wanted ad. My first real paid gig in the business was basically a production coordinator, booking studio time, working with studios in New York City, many of which are long gone, but Right Track, Hit Factory, Sony Music Studios, on behalf of these artists, sitting behind the desk with the engineers. Hey, what does this do? What's a flying fader? Oh, show me how you're patching these cables. What's the signal chain? Oh, wait, are you treating that vocal before or after it's recorded? Like, I'm trying to understand, we're going to start recording digitally. First it's 2-inch tape, and then it's a Sony 3348, which is this huge machine on wheels. And then it's like, oh, someone brought in a Mac computer and it's got this thing called Pro Tools on it. What's Pro Tools? Oh, wait a minute. The faders are on the screen of the computer. Like, I'm really dating myself. But that to me was a great period of my life because the mystery, like I had recorded demos in my high school band. So I had been in a studio. I understood what a studio was. But to actually have a year or two with real skilled professionals in the space in New York City, sort of at the golden age of the CD era, and looking at a Neve console, right? Understanding, looking at these Focusrite mic pre's and like looking at the studio and understanding how it all worked. Again, I've forgotten half of what I learned back then. But that was another piece of the industry, like the mystery dissolving in front of me. And instead of it making me feel like, wow, there's just too much to learn, it made me more excited and more interested. And then I mentioned this idea of being gifted the website. And so then I had to learn about HTML and coding websites and so on. And so for me, it was this constant zigzagging from one set of learnings to another as I'm wending my way in and around the industry. Ironically, I never even worked at a label until after I got out of grad school. I worked for 2 years at the parent company for BMG, worked in Midtown Manhattan, Times Square, right over the Virgin Megastore. That same building was called the Bertelsmann Building on 45th Street. And all of the BMG labels were in there. So you can imagine Arista and all of those, RCA. This is before the Sony merger, and the Sony merger happened when I was exiting and I went to go work at Clear Channel, which is a whole other part of my career. But that was a really interesting time for me, but it was never a straight line. My uncle likes to use this phrase that he says, my life has been aleatory. And what he means by that is it's governed by fate. I never had a 5-year plan. I didn't know where I was going. I just took one step at a time, looked around me, what opportunities, who can I talk to? How can I be curious? How can I be of service to the people around me? And I made plenty of mistakes. I remember once when I was in college, I was told by a friend, hey, I can't take this internship at DGC Records. Maybe you want to check it out. Now, this was my dream. DGC had signed Sonic Youth. DGC put out Nevermind by Nirvana. And so I think I was a junior in college, and I thought, this is it. And I went and I met with the VP. I don't know what he did, but he had a Bad Brains poster on his wall. We were talking about the English punk band Discharge. I was in heaven. I'm like, I'm home. But I never bothered to tell the guy, because I didn't know any better, that I wasn't the guy that he thought he was supposed to be interviewing that day. My friend couldn't do it, so he sent me in his place. And it never occurred to me. So I get a call a week later, and the guy's saying, well, we liked you very much, but we can't trust you. You claim to be someone that you're not. And I didn't even know. Maybe I would have started in the label sooner, who knows? But these things happen, and you just have to learn. It's like, okay, I'm responsible for being me, and I'm responsible for showing up on time and being really transparent. And you learn these lessons across the way. But I didn't know. I was incredibly fortunate. But I'd also like to think that I took advantage of the opportunities as they came to me.
Well, and that's what I was going to say is it's funny because when you tell your parents that you're going to be a musician and that's what you want to do with your life or whatever that is, my parents always supported what I did.
What a gift.
Yeah. And thank God it worked out for sure. There's more at work than just my abilities.
I hope you're enjoying this episode so far and you're getting motivated to take your guitar playing to the next level. Please do me a favor and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts. It'll help the show grow and reach more rock stars like you who want to improve their guitar playing. Also, I'd love to know what parts of the episode you liked, as well as what you learned. So please share this podcast and tag us at guitar-zoom.com on your social post. And now, let's get back to the podcast.
I always tell people when I was a kid, I never said no to anything because I was always worried that if I said no to something, that's a door that's shutting. And then whatever opportunity is behind that door, I'm not going to experience. So you do everything. Anytime you get an opportunity to do anything, you do it all. The only thing I found is that at some point in my life, I was burning myself out because I was so busy that everything snowballs. Because if that door does open and there are opportunities, now you're doing those opportunities. So everything just keeps exponentially getting bigger and bigger and bigger, to the point when I was in my late 30s, I was early 40s, I was just losing my mind. And that's the same time that I was still trying to get this online thing to become something. Thank God it did. I mean, that thing moved in and I was able to learn how to say no. I mean, near divorce, everything like that, and start focusing on what people ask me now, what I do for a living, husband and a father. That really is what I do. And I don't even have a job. Everything I do, I love to do. And I'm thankful every day I get up, talk to guys like you and hang out. And this is what I do for a living. So my point is that I think when you're younger, you have to be really careful to try and seize those opportunities. If you're not going to step outside the box that you think you've built for yourself, you're going to miss out on so many great things. And sometimes they don't lead to anything. Sometimes they're just bunk. But there's so many other times that those things will lead to something that can steer you somewhere else in your life and lead you to who knew I was going to be doing what I'm doing now? I didn't have a plan.
So one of the things we think about at the company, and one of the things I was taught in my business life, is to really show a lot of discernment about where you put your focus. And the example that's often given is you can keep track of maybe 10 things at a given time, right? And the two of those 10 things that are working really well, that's obvious, right? And it's like, those are stars. You're not going to stop doing those things, whether for you, it's your podcast or your YouTube channel. That stuff is really clear that it's working. And then there's probably two of those 10 things that are really not working. And it's like, okay, those are dogs. It's obvious that's not going to be where you're going to continue to focus your efforts. Most people are pretty good about those top and bottom two because they present themselves very obviously. Where we all get hung up is the middle six. The middle six, right? Oh, if we just give it a little more time, if we throw a little more investment, money, effort, maybe it'll get there. This is so important to so-and-so, or my coworker or my friend. It's like their pet project and I don't want to disappoint them. Or, oh, there was something outside of our control that impacted this. And hey, next year we'll be able to give it a real shot because this year the conditions weren't right. That's a way of all of us fooling ourselves. I worked in radio for 12 years. I was never a radio programmer. I never sold radio advertising. I worked on the digital side, the event side. I helped to create a platform called iHeartRadio that I'm sure a lot of folks have heard of. I worked at this big broadcast radio company trying to help them develop a real proper digital and events strategy. I helped to create an award show called the iHeartRadio Music Awards, helped to create a music festival called the iHeartRadio Music Festival, and was very involved in all that stuff at its inception. Was very, very exciting and enjoyed that. And one of the things that I would hear from the smartest and best programmers all the time, and this is more true for maybe later rather than when you're a kid and you want to try lots of things, but that the key to success for any radio station, narrow the focus to broaden the result. You can't be all things to all people. They know what they're good at.
They don't need to make chicken sandwiches and everything else. What they do, it's like the Pareto rule, the 80-20 rule. What they do great, and they don't need to change a thing.
That's right. And that's really informed how we think about the online music education space. I just went through this process with the team because we got 4 companies in the portfolio of thinking about what are the strategies going to be for the next year. And I asked the divisional leads to come, hey, like, you want to do next year? What are your aspirations? What are your goals for the organization? And everybody's got a slightly different take. ArtistWorks is a very different platform from Fader Pro, and TrueFire is got a different positioning in the market and works with different kinds of artists than the other folks do. But they all came back with some really, really consistent themes. At the top of the list, artists, right? So again, people think about online music education or they think about YouTube or what have you, and they're just like, oh, let me teach you something. From our standpoint, all we want to do is we want to partner with artists like you, Steve, people who've been out there in the world, who have something to contribute, because for us, who you put in front of the camera and the stories that they can tell and the experience that they can bring to bear, that's at the center of what we do. It's not peripheral. It's not a nice to have. It is everything. We think of what we're doing as a three-legged stool. So what are the legs of the stool? The first is the learners. It's got to be a great product. It's got to have value. It's got to be something that's going to actually give you satisfaction and make your experience of learning the instrument, guitar in this case, one that's enjoyable and convenient, right? And really pay dividends. But the second leg of the stool, the middle leg, artists. Either we are providing real opportunities for artists to make money, to spread their word, to solidify and document their legacy, to connect with their most passionate fans, right? If we're not doing that, we're nowhere. So you think about it that way. I think a lot of companies out there, and this is not just about music education, but a lot of companies that either work with artists or in the creative space, they're thinking, hey, let me just sell. Let me just find who the audience is. And what I'm saying to you is, particularly you mentioned the creator economy. We work with creators. There is no True Fire without creators. And who are our creators, right? Some of the most amazing musical geniuses that you can imagine. I just think about the Robin Fords of the world, or the late, recently departed great Pat Martino, or I mentioned Alex Skolnick, or Dweezil Zappa, or any of these folks who have made some kind of Jennifer Batten. I could go on and on and on and on. They're just extraordinary people. And it's a pleasure and an honor for us to be able to promulgate their knowledge, but also, as you said, their stories, their narrative, right? Because you got to wrap it around. It's not like, show me how to play the change. What was going through your mind? What occurred to you? How did you come to this?
Yeah,
that's so magical.
I totally agree. Well, that's so awesome. Well, I don't want to keep you way too much longer, but I do want to end with a couple things here, because this is always fun for me. You just have to grab whatever's in your mind.
Got it.
Don't think too hard about this. If you had to choose your top 5 albums or artists all time, what would they be?
Okay, so I can give you 3 really, really easily, I think. It's going to be a little bit of a left turn, but I think, say it wrong, but London Calling by The Clash is going to be number 1 for me. The second album I think I would go right away to would be Mission of Burma Versus, which is from 1982, incredible Boston punk band who were really early experimenting with tape loops. Believe it or not, I think I have to put one of those Metallica records. It's like Sophie's Choice, choosing between the babies. There's sometimes I feel like it's got to be Ride the Lightning, but usually I think I would say it's Master of Puppets. So I gave you 3 super, super easy.
Sure.
I was such a grunge fan when that came out. I think I heard Bleach by Nirvana in the winter of 1989, in December of 1989, when I was in England. I came back home and went to the CBGB's record canteen and bought it immediately. Although I love those albums, I think maybe I would actually say that Louder Than Love by Soundgarden would be, as much as I love Nirvana, and I loved all those bands, and I loved all of them. I'm talking about Mudhoney and Tad and all of it. I was on the Sub Pop singles distribution list, mailing list. I subscribed, the whole thing. But Soundgarden, even though they only put out 1 record on Sub Pop, because of Kim Thayil's playing and the heaviness and the fact that it felt more like that sludgy metal that I was talking about earlier that I loved, they to me, and of course Chris Cornell's extraordinary vocals, I was so attached to him. He was one of my musical heroes, and it's embarrassing, but in 1989 and 1990, my friends at school used to call me Sound Owen because I was so obsessed with them. I saw them play a gig, I shit you not, I saw them play a gig where Faith No More, Voivod, and Soundgarden were on the same bill in 1989. Soundgarden was touring Louder Than Love, Faith No More was touring The Real Thing, Voivod was touring Nothing Face.
Those are all iconic albums right there.
And I think I'm going to throw in Dimension Hatros by Voivod as my 5th. I'm sorry, like people are like, who is this crazy person? But yeah, those are all records I love.
People to listen to. I think even mentioning Bleach, people get by far as my favorite for sure.
I think those records are amazing. And look, any one of those records has like 4 or 5 records that surround it that are very much of that era, very much of that ilk. I didn't mention South of Heaven by Slayer, which I just think is a masterpiece. I love that album so much. I didn't mention Among the Living by Anthrax. You know, again, as a New York guy, I never got to meet any of Metallica was Bay Area, Slayer was California, but the Anthrax guys would come to the shows. I would see Scott Ian. I would see Dan Lilker, who played in Nuclear Assault and SOD with Billy Milano and Scott Ian. And those guys were accessible. This is what I mean about the scene. I could be in the audience at CBGB's watching a hardcore punk band or a metal band, and I might be shoulder to shoulder with one of these guys. And the thing about that was it taught me something very early on, which is particularly, you don't want to bother someone when they're having dinner. But if you really care about a musician and you see them and you're not bothering them, you're not like ruining a moment they're having with their family. I've never once met a musician who didn't really appreciate an authentic thank you. I've never seen it. So I've told you I love punk. Paul Weller, the lead singer of The Jam, one of my favorite punk acts, was sitting having cappuccino on the corner of Houston and Canal Street in Manhattan. And he's notoriously irascible. He's a grumpy old guy, but he's very cool. And I saw him just sitting by himself drinking a cappuccino. And I said, you know what? I'm never not going to take advantage of this opportunity. Oh, Mr. Weller, I'm such a huge fan. I love your solo work. I love the Style Council, but I especially, The Jam means so much to me. And grumpy Paul Weller was like, I really appreciate you stopping by and telling me that. That was it. I didn't press it. But that to me was a real learning, and growing up and being in New York City and occasionally, not often, but occasionally rubbing shoulder to shoulder with these people. They're just folks like you and me.
That's right. It's funny you mentioned Anthrax. The thick of all the things I was doing, Dan Spitz has always been one of my favorite guitar players.
Amazing guitar player.
He's almost like the Alex Lifeson of metal because it's so quirky and so unusual and so outside the lines. And those albums with Dan Spitz.
They can't sound that way without him, because Scott Ian is coming out of a very power chord, riff-driven, simple, like his big influences, like the English punk band I was mentioning earlier, Discharge, or some of the hardcore stuff. And Spitz gives it the musicality and gives it the technique. Now, I'm not saying Scott's not a good guitar player. He's a good guitar player, but he's a riff writer. Dan is the guy who elevates the music.
That's right. Similar to Chris DeGarmo in Queensryche.
Yeah, exactly right.
DeGarmo gone, and you give it to Michael Wilton, it's a little more straightforward rock and roll, straightforward metal thing without that crazy flavor that Chris DeGarmo would give it. Because same thing, Operation Mindcrime, one of my top 5 albums of all time.
That is right outside of my top 5. And Jeff, his vocals to me really pushed that over the top. His operatic range and his feel. I mean, it's one thing to sing with that technique, but to bring so much emotion into it. I mean, I just think about that record. It sends chills down my spine because he's such a good storyteller.
Absolutely.
Concept record. Who does these anymore? I love them.
That's right. Okay, here's another one for you. So other interests that you have completely outside of music, completely outside of the tech element, like what's the stuff that you like to do?
I love working out. Exercise has been a real savior for me, at times a big maximal stress. And when the pandemic happened, I realized everyone was doing the same thing, comfort food and a lot of Netflix. And I looked down at a certain point and I'm like, you know what? One thing I know I can control is my health and wellness. And so I just started to pay more attention to that. And that's really been, I think, a source of strength for me, energy, but not just physical strength. I'm talking about emotional, mental strength. And whether it's lifting weights or and I've got a beautiful Australian Shepherd, Betty, she's a doll. I love dogs and I love my dog. And I live right next to Prospect Park in Brooklyn, 2 blocks from my house, and just exploring the park, which is gorgeous and huge, and you can never see every nook and cranny. So I just love living where I live and exploring. I joke about it with my wife. What I used to think was a long walk before the pandemic, that wasn't a long walk. We walk everywhere. I walk to get groceries. It's like, who needs a car? First of all, we live in Brooklyn for starters, but second of all, this idea somehow that certain distances were too far. I take the dog out for an hour and a half in the morning. I look down at the pedometer. I've walked 5 miles, right? So it just, that to me has been great. I've always been a big reader, love reading fiction, all kinds of different fiction. I'm reading Richard Powers' The Overstory right now. It's just cracked into it. But I love science fiction. I love fantasy. I love it all. My son and I watched The Witcher on Netflix. So then I was like, well, I wonder how these books are. And I picked up the first book and I'm like, this is great. And so I'm really omnivorous as it pertains to that. But reading is great, obviously. Guitar. I don't know that I have time for much more hobbies. Like you, I identify as a father. And so spending time, my 19-year-old's away now because he's at college, but spending time with him is maybe my favorite hobby. Whatever we're doing, whether we're watching a basketball game or we're out in the city getting Chinese food or whatever. So those are a couple of things, maybe not as exciting as people are skydiving or motorcycle racing. I don't have any of that, but I love traveling. My wife and I like to travel. We're away over the summer. We try to get away 2 or 3 times a year if we can. I always bring my laptop with me. I'm never off the clock. And that's because, like you, I love what I do. And so it doesn't feel like a hassle. I want to be there for the team and I want to help and continue to grow this business because I think it's a wonderful business.
Well, thank you so much, Owen, for your time. Honestly, it's been really great just hanging out with you.
We barely scratched the surface, dude. Like, I feel like there's so much more music to talk about. I'm really, it's funny, you never know. I did my diligence and I looked you up and I knew that you would get all the references. But I just think about it. I was going through I kept all my vinyl from when I'm a teenager, and I was going through all my vinyl and I was just thinking to myself, wow, there's just so much history there, not to mention all the music I've discovered in the last 10 or 15 years. So I really look forward to continuing that conversation with you. And I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, I think it would be fun. And it's funny because so often you get older, you forget about the joy that all of that stuff brought you, talking about the musicians and talking about their gear and breaking down songs and all those kinds of things. And like somebody might do watching a football game and watching football plays, but we do that with music. And I just talk about that all day long. So thank you so much for spending over an hour with me. I'm sure you've got a million other things to do, but I really do appreciate your time, man.
I have a million other things to do, but none quite as fun as talking music, right? Can never beat that. All right, Steve, great to connect. I really appreciate your time, and thanks to your audience for listening.
Yeah. So obviously you can check out Owen all over the place, but we've already mentioned the websites. And if you're a follower of mine, you already know Jan Play True Fire. And I love teaching and I love people who love teaching. At the end of the day, I always tell people I'm a guitar motivator is really what I am. I want people to be happy. Not every day can be that way, and not that things aren't frustrating, but you don't have to be the best player in the block. You just have to find a way of enjoying the journey. That's the most important thing. And with Owen and Jan Play True Fire, as much as GuitarZoom, you can do that. So please make sure if you haven't checked out those things that you do. Thank you so much, Owen, for everything. And hopefully, again, we're going to be able to talk sometime soon here again, okay?
Yeah, and then next time we talk, I'm going to ask you whether or not you want to become a True Fire Studios educator, because
Okay.
I couldn't resist. I have to throw the deep ball and see. We'd love to have you. So we can obviously talk about that. But thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Great talk.
All right. Take care, and we'll talk soon, okay?
Thank you.
All right, buddy.
If you enjoyed today's podcast and want to learn guitar even faster, go to guitarzoom.com and click the Get Started button to get access to courses that are right for your interest and skill level. Again, go to guitarzoom.com and click the Get Started button.